Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth, the Education Coordinator for Marlene's Market and Deli. This afternoon's guest we have with us is Dr. Deanna Minich. Yay! She is a local book author of Whole Detox and the Rainbow Diet and has spoken with us many times, and every time that we are blessed with her presence, we are very honored. So thank you so much, Dr. Deanna Minich, for being here with us. Yay!
Hey, thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks to everybody who has showed up on this Saturday. I see, again, a lot of my friends here, Barbie and Maggie, and let's see, Mary Ellen. And, I see some names that I know that we connect through various pages. So thank you all for being here. And I would say that if you have questions as we go, definitely put those in the chat. And Elizabeth and I can field those on the Marlene's Market and Deli page. I'll also put this recording on my Deanna Minich PhD page. So if there are questions that arise that I am able to answer that are more educational and not prescriptive, I'm glad to do so. So let's dive in, everybody. Lots of tools here. This is a big topic. As I was telling Elizabeth before we went live, it's a really big deal to focus on inflammation because inflammation is the foundation of so many chronic diseases. And the more inflamed we are, the more that our immune system gets depleted and taxed and has to overwork. Inflammation overworks us. It ages us, it stresses us out, and it could be happening in our bodies without really knowing about it. So I'm going to give you some signs and symptoms of inflammation. We're going to talk about food and even lifestyle. And again, this is for education only. Nothing is meant to be prescriptive. You really do want to work with a practitioner who understands root cause medicine. What does that mean? That means really diving into the depth of what's going on within you from a biochemical standpoint, emotional, mental, spiritual, really the whole spectrum. I think that that's really important. And I do take kind of that full spectrum approach to everything. So even inflammation, I am looking at emotions. I'm looking at what are we thinking? What is our sense of meaning and purpose? All of that. And so as Elizabeth mentioned, I've written books and I do a lot of different things. All right, so these are the three things that I'd like you to leave the presentation with. Number one, recognize the signs of inflammation. What does it actually mean? Sometimes inflammation is not apparent, right? We could have an injury, we get inflamed, it becomes red and swollen, and we have to address that. But sometimes inflammation is not always in a way presenting in our body in a way that we can recognize. So I'm going to talk about that. Then we're going to move into food. I'm going to give you 7 ways to cool down through food. Then we'll get into 6 lifestyle tips. So Elizabeth mentioned that she's studying exercise science, which beautifully couples her nutrition background. And that's really what we need to do. There are these building blocks, right? It's not just food alone. Food goes into many different aspects of our lives. And so we will talk about some lifestyle tips for fun. All right, so let's talk about the first one, signs of inflammation. Let me ask you all, and you can do this in the chat, which of the following is true? A, inflammation is related to the onset and progression of different diseases. B, we are eating more pro-inflammatory food. C, we are living a more inflamed life. Or D, all of the above. So what do y'all think about that? So I'll let you just take a second to be thinking about that. You could tell I'm a teacher. I like making multiple choices. In fact, as a professor over these past years, I've even done multiple choices, which students don't tend to really like. But this one is pretty straight and narrow. This one, the correct answer is D. It's all of the above. As I mentioned, inflammation is related to so many different diseases, everything from cancer to cardiovascular disease to autoimmune disease, you name it. I don't think that there's probably, there aren't too many different conditions that aren't related to inflammation. We're also eating a more processed, and I would even say ultra processed diet. And even for those of us who are eating very well, I would say relatively, there are still things in our food that we can't always account for. So I'm going to get into that. And also, there's just stress in our environment. I don't know if any of you feel that just over these past 2 years, but there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of isolation. Our big focus now, I would say globally, is mental health, looking at sleep disturbance, looking at anxiety, rates of depression, which are going up. So I do think that inflammation in the mind can translate to changes in the body, just like changes in the body can lead to changes in the mind. It's interrelated. In general, we're on fire. There's this phrase of brain on fire, gut on fire, liver on fire. And it's more or less a metaphor, but it really does speak to the increases in inflammation, which underpin all of these different chronic diseases that are out there. So I would say when you don't know where to turn, when you're working with your healthcare practitioner, you really can't go wrong in dealing with some of the principles of looking at how to bring the body into balance with inflammatory type of processes. So there is acute inflammation. So let's say that you're riding a bike, you fall off, scrape your knee, acute inflammation, right? Your body actually needs to kind of go through that process of healing. So there will be redness, there'll be pain, there'll be swelling. In the case of something like a viral infection, there's typically a fever, and that fever is generating the body's response. But then there's the other kind of inflammation that most people aren't aware of, and that is that of chronic inflammaging, as it's referred to. So there are things, perhaps like whether we're eating certain things in our diet, where it's just perpetuating inflammation at the level of the gut. We know that the gut is a big portal to so much of our body, our behavior, our activity. And so there can be subtle things that we're doing every day. We may not even realize it, but it could be causing inflammation at a very low chronic level, more or less eating away at our reserves. The classic hallmarks of inflammation, what do they look like? Redness, pain, heat, swelling, and ultimately loss of function and debilitation. So anytime we experience those things in the body, and whether all or just one of these, that is something we definitely have to be paying attention to. And again, sometimes in a more acute setting, it's obvious. And then there might be the low level types. For example, gum disease. For many people, there is this sense of having inflammation even in a tooth. Go and have your regular checkups with your dentist. I kind of see the mouth as an example of, it's a microcosm of the macrocosm of our body. It's just one example. So there could be something going on in our mouth that could be signaling that we have systemic inflammation, a little stiffness in our hips, or even something in our big toe. It could be happening anywhere in the body. It could happen with a meal, where we feel fatigued after the meal. We may not be able to feel and sense the redness, pain, heat, and swelling, but it could be happening more systemically through an elevation of certain things that we call inflammatory cytokines, or even the different fats that are released from the liver. So one of the things I like is to look at an integration of the different medical systems, because I think all of them hold their inherent truth. So in traditional Chinese medicine, they would look at inflammation in a little bit of a different way than I'm mentioning with the redness, pain, heat, and swelling. But there's a sense of reactivity, or something that's going quickly. Again, we want the body to be back into balance, not too slow, not too fast, but just right, kind of that Goldilocks principle. So I'm married to an acupuncturist, so we talk about traditional Chinese medicine as it relates to functional medicine. So looking at the tongue, feeling the pulse. In Ayurvedic medicine, which is the long-standing traditional medicine in India and in other places like also Nepal, what we see is that there are different constitutional types that might be more primed towards certain aspects of inflammation, like the Pitta dosha. We all have these elements within us However, in certain people, they might actually rev up quicker and faster than in others. And we might also change throughout the life cycle. So every decade may be different. Every year could be different. Every day could be different, depending on what we're eating, what the season is, and how all of those things are coming together. And then, as I mentioned, in Western medicine, typically we're looking at, on a lab, we're looking at things like high sensitivity C-reactive protein. We're looking at blood fats. We are looking at homocysteine. We're looking at blood sugar. We're looking at insulin, because blood sugar definitely ties right in there with inflammation, as does the stress response. Now, I know that for all of us, we probably have immune function on our minds in some way, shape, or form, which is a really good thing to be thinking about, of course. And so if we think about inflammation and how it connects to immune function, just to cover a couple of different things here, there can be some root causes to be thinking about that can perpetuate inflammation in the body, such as infections. So latent infections, whether microbial infections, viral infections, even fungal infections. And sometimes we've got a lot of that stuff going on at the level of the gut that need to be properly diagnosed and then treated by a healthcare practitioner. Trauma, toxins. Toxins are a big one. I think that because we see all of these changes in our environment happening, those changes in the environment, greater pollutants, more organic pollutants that persist over time, these toxins begin to change our physiology and how our body's responding. Also, not having proper levels of nutrients can predispose us to the effects of inflammation to a greater degree than if we didn't have those nutrients. So looking at, and you're going to see, I'm going to talk about omega-3 fats. This is one of the important, I would say, hallmarks of helping with inflammation. And then also working with a practitioner to assess allergies or food intolerances. You know, I think many of you probably are aware of this, but we're in food ruts many times, right? We eat the same thing day after day. And sometimes some of those things are going to perpetuate the inflammatory response. So it's good to check that out by doing an elimination diet or working with a healthcare practitioner who can actually take a blood sample and send it in for analysis to look at reactivity of your body with certain components in food. The presentations I've already discussed, and then the spectrum of inflammation at all different levels. I've already mentioned that term inflammaging. So this is a very interesting term. It was coined some years ago in the science. It's the low-level chronic inflammation that leads to accelerated aging. So many people are focused on aging these days. How do we age well? And in fact, the largest proportion of the population, I believe it's globally, is from 60 plus, right? And that's only going to continue to grow. And so what I would say, because we're living longer and we need to ensure that every decade we're really tending to our health needs so that the next decade is that much greater ahead and we can deal with any types of changes in reserves or structure or function. So catching inflammation quick is really the key. The other term that's emerging in the research is called coagulaging, meaning that with inflammation, many times this sets off a cascade in the body, which can lead to greater blood clotting. And if you have more clots in the blood vessels, you're going to have stagnant blood flow. You may even have other issues that relate to heart health or brain health. And so it's really important to assess what your inflammation status is because it ties into every single body system. If we let inflammation go on, it can lead to more inflammation. It's kind of like fire. Think of the fire element, and I'm going to talk about fire in a second. But fire can rage. So the earlier you can catch a fire, the better, because then it just kind of feeds off of itself, right? So if we don't nip that inflammation in the bud, it can lead to more inflammation, impaired immune response. And many times you might even hear this type of terminology from people with autoimmune conditions that they have flares. They have certain instances where something they ate or something they did is upregulating the inflammatory response, and eventually we can get degradation of tissue and declining organ function. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff to consider, which is why I do encourage everybody to really work with a practitioner to assess this. I'm a scientist by training, and so I always think in terms of mechanism. Why? Just keep going down that ladder of like, but why? Why did this happen? When did it happen? And asking all of those questions. And when you're thinking about inflammation, I think it's good to consider not just food, even though we're going to focus on food, but also the health of your gut microbiome. Certain people will have certain genetics, certain genes that may predispose them to getting more inflamed quicker. I remember seeing a client in the clinic that I was in some years ago, and she was naturally predisposed to autoimmune conditions. She had 2 of them. And when we ran her genetics, it was pretty obvious that she had a propensity towards inflammation. She had TNF alpha and IL-6, 2 of the big inflammatory mediators and messengers in the body that were more, I would say, they presented genetically in such a way that her body would be more inflamed. So she had to definitely keep watch on that. Hormone imbalance, as women go through perimenopause, or even a woman through her monthly cycle, is going to be more, I would say, sensitive to inflammation at certain points of her cycle, just like she would through the perimenopause, and even especially in postmenopause. And there even needs to be more diligence with inflammation at that time. Looking at nutrients and digestion, how well you digest will tell you how well your nutrient status can be bolstered, right? We can be eating all the best food, but if we're not digesting that food, we're not taking it up, we're not assimilating, we're not actually able to use it. Infections, as I mentioned, and we'll get into lifestyle, and then assessing toxic load. So thinking about your body like a web, right? Because everything is all very much interconnected, which is why we think about the gut, and we think about how the gut connects to the brain, connects to the heart, connects to the skin, connects to many different functions. So continue to broaden and expand how inflammation ripples through the body. And the beautiful thing about the body is that if we just make one small step in the direction of an improvement, just one small thing, it could have that ripple through effect, because again, everything is all connected. So if you start to work on your gut, you are actually going to start to see that ripple effect going through into the brain. You're going to have changes in multiple body systems just by working on one system. So that's why I often say that there's no real wrong approach. It's just having an approach and getting started. All right, I do like to bring a little bit of poetry and symbolism into my teaching as well. And I think about the 4 elements. I've already mentioned fire, an imbalance of fire, and really all of us embody all of these elements. And sometimes there is one that is a little bit imbalanced. So if we have a lot of fire, metaphorically, i.e. lots of inflammation, maybe we need to be more hydrated. We need to start using some of the other elements to be a little bit more healing. Maybe we need to bring in more of the air, our oxygen, checking in with breath in order to relax our body. So don't forget that you've got these elements at your disposal. But the fire element is pretty significant, and that's what traditional medicine systems would say, especially as it relates to inflammation. So let me just show you a profile. This is something that I have in my whole detox book, where in the chapter on yellow, where I talk about fire, the fire system of health, I have people assess whether or not they have an imbalanced fire aspect in the body, right? And that could manifest as physical as well as psychological. So somebody who is not in balance with their fire would have lots of stuff happening in the gut, lots of indigestion, burning, reflux. They may have intolerances or allergies to food. They may need certain food to kind of rev them up. So having more sugar or caffeine. They might have more belly fat, which correlates with higher cortisol. So stress hormones. Tends to be excessively busy. You know, somebody who's very fiery. I mean, just think of it. It's somebody who's very active. It's kind of like the fire aspect, right? And so they move quick. They're very reactive. They might be overthinking and overdoing anything. And I must say, this is also my tendency. I have to keep my fire element in check. And when I have had people do the questionnaire that I have in my whole detox book, this system goes out of balance. Out of all of the 7, this is the one system looking at fire that 80% of people have an imbalance here. So even if you say, well, Deanna, on this list, maybe I can relate to 3 of these, but those 3 could be pretty significant in terms of changing physiology or psychology. So if somebody's in balance with their fire, their digestion is good, they have healthy normal blood sugar within normal ranges, they feel inspired rather than overwhelmed. So when I think of overwhelm, I think of feeling burnt out. I hear that so often these days, just feeling burnt out, fried. I mean, even look at the terminology we use to talk about that aspect of how inflammation can permeate our mental sphere, our mental conscious and awareness. So having a healthy appetite, having work with play, having things overall in balance. So let's get into cooling off. And again, because we're like a web, systems biology, systems medicine, I would say we can go after any of these aspects on the spectrum. And I like to follow what we have momentum and passion for. So if that's to focus on a community, or if it's to focus on emotions or physical activity, everybody has to decide what is best for them. But I'm going to focus on food and then close with lifestyle, because food is my background, is my training. And so if we look at food in our everyday lives, it's kind of crazy and it's kind of inflamed, isn't it? I mean, we're doing this roller coaster dieting, gigantic portions. I would say many people aren't eating outside the home like we have been. So that maybe is one aspect of improvement. But in general, even the foods that we are eating are depleted, and we may not be as active as we need to be, truly. And food is different today, even though we could be making very healthy choices. Many times in our food supply, it's just like a laundry list of so many different ingredients, even if they're good, healthy ingredients, right? So how do we skew more towards nature rather than human-made foods? That's really the goal. But in general, the type of food profile that would lead to more inflammation in the body is what I call the brown, yellow, and white diet. It's eating a lot of these crisp, high heat foods, a lot of foods that lack color. And many times we have too much food, and that can cause inflammation as well. And by eating a lot of these brown, yellow, and white foods and having too many of them, we displace the space for the nutrient dense foods. So we become undernourished. Just to show you the power of food, and I really love these, they call them acute meal studies, where you take one meal and you look at the effects within about 4 to 6 hours. And this was a study in which they looked at a single fast food style meal. And if you look at the bottom there, these were some of the sample meals, lots of brown, yellow, and white. And over the course of 4 to 6 hours, they would look at inflammation. And one of the inflammatory markers that they looked at was called interleukin-6, and it increased over that time frame after eating. And just think about it for yourself. Have you ever just not felt good after eating food, where you feel tired, fatigued, maybe even flu-like? I mean, food is supposed to give us energy. And of course, the digestive tract takes a bit of energy to process that. And it takes even more if we don't have good, healthy digestion. So what we ultimately want to see is not inflammation, but energy. We don't want, one of the signs of inflammation that I did not talk about, because it's not in the classic repertoire of symptoms, but we're seeing it more and more, is fatigue, energy loss, right? Because the body is so taxed. it's taxed through that whole process of inflammation that it doesn't have energy to spare. Now, this is a nice study showing that by adding in vegetables with certain vitamins and fiber, and that was to a more inflammatory meal, that the effects of that meal on a marker of inflammation in the body known as endothelial dysfunction was lessened. In other words, the blood vessels responded better when there were different markers of color in the meal, right? You can actually eat smarter, because I don't think that every meal is going to be perfect, right? Where it's 100% anti-inflammatory. Sometimes we have to couple things together that we know are anti-inflammatory and bring it with the what might be a little bit more pro-inflammatory, and then we neutralize those effects. Here is a short list of anti-inflammatory nutrients, but I am going to talk more about foods and food patterns. But typically I think about fats. My PhD was on essential fatty acids, and I have a great appreciation for these fats because they're in every cell membrane. And so if we are having good, healthy fats, and that's in balance to other fats in the body, then already we're giving the body an edge as it relates to being anti-inflammatory. There are also certain antioxidant vitamins and minerals. And I would say, I just had a friend email me, we were talking this morning, because I had been encouraging her to get her vitamins and minerals tested. Because so many people ask me, well, Deanna, how much do I take of vitamin D? How much do I take of selenium? And I say, it's so hard to say unless you actually get those things measured. And we were thinking, in the case of my friend, that she might need more nutrients because she has an autoimmune condition. But it actually turned out that her supplementation regimen was actually quite good because everything fell in line. So that's good information as well. Now, if there was deficiency, then you could get a better gauge on how much of certain vitamins and minerals you might have to complement together with the foods that you're eating, right? So I would say test, don't guess. And I'm glad to, this is something you can do through your healthcare provider. It's not always very expensive. There are certain tests that can be done pretty seamlessly, and you get a lot of information. Then you're not spending all that money on supplements. You're actually spending the money on the test to know exactly what you need. For example, an omega-3 fatty acid test could cost you like $54. And that $54 can tell you for the next 3 to 4 months whether or not you are tracking with a good percentage that would reduce inflammation. So there's a smart way, I think, to work with all of these different anti-inflammatory nutrients. And so when I think about foods, when I start to think about a pattern of foods and what does that look like, these are some of the elements that I have seen over time clinically and also through the scientific literature. Going gluten-free, I think, can be good for the majority of people, just because it's a marker of processed food many times. But, not everything that is gluten-free is anti-inflammatory. Keep that in mind. Many times a gluten-free processed type product will have rice and other things that are high in glycemic index, or, maybe high in arsenic, because rice tends to be high in arsenic. And there are some studies showing that when people eat gluten-free, if they're not doing it in a more nutrient dense way, they can actually be getting more toxic metals and less of the minerals, because a lot of these refined, I would say, grains are used as replacements for wheat or barley or rye. And so that's just something to note, that just because something is gluten-free doesn't mean it's healthy nor anti-inflammatory. I'm a big color person, so I like colors in my meals. And as I mentioned, I do have an affinity for all things fat and making sure that we balance those fatty acids in our daily diet. Even though I'm not about a certain diet, I do think that having more protein, healthy fats, and colors is really a nice algorithm for reducing inflammation. I have this energetics of food, and in general, if we look at traditional patterns of eating, having the yang warming foods, which, again, a little bit of heat to food is not a bad thing. It's just that most people skew way too much over to those warming foods. and not enough over to the cooling foods. So as I talk about inflammation in foods, this is really nothing new. This is nothing new in science. This has been, I would say, part of the cornerstone of traditional medicine for thousands of years. So we're now bringing science to test out a lot of these ideas around warming and cooling foods. I also think because of the focus on accelerated aging with inflammation, there are certain pathways as it relates to aging, whether looking at how the cell cleans up damaged material or how well we're in sync with our circadian rhythm. These types of things can also be impacted through inflammation. So again, as you can see, all of the different plant-based foods, and again, I'm not wedded to a certain dietary dogma, but I do think that more color from whole plant-based foods, regardless if you eat animal products, is a good thing, right? It's good to have more color. That's something we can all share in. All right, so that should give you a broad swath of all things inflammation. And I'm going to zip through the things to help you cool down through food and see what you feel a connection with. I would hope that as we close our time together, that all of you can tell me like, wow, this is one thing I'm thinking about. Like, you helped me remember, you reminded me to focus on this. And I always feel like, wherever we're at and whatever we connect to, to really follow that through. There might be something in that for you. Now, you may not want to change your food. So one of the first things that I talk about is not changing the food, but changing how you cook it. So whenever you see crisp, grilled, fried food, just equate that with too much fire, right? It just tells you that the food, it's showing you the fire when you see all the brown, right? And that's why I say brown, yellow, and white. White, white sugar, white flour, white salt. Yellow, I think of a lot of pastas and bagels and cookies and breads and a lot of refined grains. And then the brown really keys into the heat, how much heat, and how we could take a vegetable and cook it to the point that it now becomes inflammatory. Now, you might be able to reduce some of that inflammatory nature of the food because it's perhaps a vegetable, but still you are going to be getting some inflammatory compounds. So I just wanted to show you this, that when we have, this is a really neat study. They took a meal, and again, it's one of those acute meal studies where they just have a meal and then they cook it in two different ways. And then they give it to a population which already has a lot of inflammation. And in this case, it was type 2 diabetics. And they cooked the meal. It consisted of a chicken breast, potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, and vegetable oil. Now, some of those things I don't love, like the vegetable oil, but still, they just took the same meal, kept it for a consistency, and then they either steamed it or boiled it, or they fried it and broiled it. So slow, moist heat versus dry, hot heat. And they found that it was better to have the meal when it was steamed or boiled, right? Having a little bit of moist heat would help with reducing the effects on this population from having that meal, the oxidative stress that would happen. So when it comes to heat, now there can already be things like nuts that we buy that are roasted, right? Now, some of you think, well, I'm eating a healthy diet. I'm vegan. I have nuts and seeds. So then I would ask you, are they roasted? Because when we apply heat to foods that we already purchase in the store, that is something to be thinking about. So this is a list in which you can see that this is how each of these food categories, how they measure up in terms of what's called advanced glycation end products, AGEs. And AGEs are when you have a protein, carbohydrate in the presence of heat, and it makes this inflammatory complex. And you get it through that heat, bringing the compounds in the food together. So not everything turns brown when it has that, like cheese. Cheese can have those. But look at the top of the list. The higher the number, the higher the AGEs, the higher the inflammation. Bacon, off the charts. And I have a good friend who always teases me about bacon and about his love of bacon. And I say, yeah, but If you really like it, just make sure you have something green with it so you offset a lot of that inflammation, because look at how high, almost 12,000 here. A broiled beef frankfurter, pan fried steak. Look at these numbers here, right? And then you go down a pizza crust. If you want a pizza, eat the pizza, but don't eat the crust. That would be one way to reduce inflammation, right? Because I'm being realistic. We're going to eat certain things at certain times, and we don't want too much perfectionism because that just leads to inflammation anyway. So let's find creative ways. Just be smart about what you're eating, and just to know the power of heat in cooking. Secondly, reduce or avoid processed sweeteners. And I think that is probably pretty intuitive. There are many names of sugar that are out there. And you've got to read those labels, and whether it's tapioca syrup or it's organic, evaporated cane sugar, all the different kinds, sugar can lead to in excess, it won't help inflammation in the body. Let's say it that way. And it can even provoke inflammation in certain cases. Number 3, avoid poor quality fats. That's why I said I didn't like vegetable oil. Too many of those seed oils, high in omega-6 fatty acids, which we're already too high on. So avoiding trans fats, which are already inherently inflammatory. How do you know if a food has trans fat? Well, now trans fat has to go on the label. So you would see if you're buying a product with a label, it'll have a section for trans fat. You can also read in the ingredient list whether or not it has any partially hydrogenated anything. Partially hydrogenated to me means it's undergone a mechanical process to modify those fats to make them more shelf stable. But in so doing, when we eat those, that creates more inflammation. So there is a lot of science about trans fat and inflammation. Dietary intake of trans fats is associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease and also associated with insulin resistance. And it just overall upregulates inflammation. So the healthy fats that we want are more of the omega-3s. And depending on your eating preferences, I have a short list here of some of them. I love chia seeds. I keep chia seeds in my freezer. Now, keep in mind that things with fats may go bad, may go rancid. So even if I have ground up flaxseed meal, I like to, when I open it, I close it, put a snap on it, like a clip, and then I put it in the freezer so that it reduces the temperature and it keeps it better preserved. Number 4, avoiding brown, yellow, and white ultra-processed foods. You already get the gist of that from what I was saying before. I grew up with a really health-conscious mom, and I think she took this phrase from Adele Davis, and she would tell me when I wanted Wonder Bread and all of the other kids would have their Wonder Bread and I wanted to be like them, and she would send me to school with brown bread. She would say, well, Deanna, just tell the kids the whiter the bread, the quicker they're dead. And of course, in the 1970s, there wasn't the same health consciousness on everybody's radar, but I think she's right. I mean, white processed foods could signal higher glycemic index, right? Higher spiking of blood sugar, as you see with this red line, through, for example, a piece of white bread. This can spike our blood sugar and then we come down. This is often commensurate with inflammation. So what we want is this low, kind of this rolling hill rather than this big peak that we might get from a lot of those processed products. So the foods that would do that would be anything that would increase or spike our blood sugar very rapidly without that gradual ascent and descent where we go up and we go down like a roller coaster. So white rice, starchy vegetables like corn, most things made of corn, starchy snack foods, high sugar desserts, you get the general sense there. And this is why whenever I talk about brown, yellow, and white, then I also bring in the discussion of color. And this is more or less the functional signature of colors for foods that I talk about in the Rainbow Diet and in the Whole Detox book, that every color in nature, the way I see it anyway, has a general theme or a signature. So you can learn more about that just by getting the books. And I talk about it on social media all the time, all the time. Number 5, avoid or minimize eating highly allergenic foods. So that's why one of the first things I do with somebody, and I've done this repeatedly in the past for decades, putting people on elimination diets, getting them off of the things that could be more reactive, and seeing how they respond, right? And then adding those things back in and seeing if there are changes in the gut, in the skin, and sleeping and mood. It's just amazing how we're each our own experiment, and we know our bodies very well, perhaps better than we realize, especially when we do an elimination diet. Minimize toxin exposure, many different ways to do that. Get your water tested. That's one of the biggest things. I think for about $150, you can get your home water tested to figure out what kind of filter would best suit your home, or you can use a very inexpensive, just a home water filter in a pitcher type of container. Having an air filter is a great investment. I would say that over the years, I've been telling people just use less in terms of personal care products if you can. Just less of, it's just, first of all, it costs so much money. Use that money towards saving up for a good air filter to have in your home. But there can be toxins in so many things. And I even say here dietary supplements, because, some of them are not testing for heavy metals. Make sure that you have a reputable manufacturer that you're buying from and that they actually do the proper third-party testing of their supplements. And number 7, avoid being fixated and stressed out about food. After I've gone through all of that, right? I don't want you to be stressed. I want you to be empowered, inspired, and informed. And so you don't want to be stressed out. Stress can cause inflammation in the body. Take this all in such a way to really reflect on what is a small thing that I can do? What's within my locus of control? Maybe you want to focus on color. Maybe you want to focus on your cooking. Maybe you just want less sugar. My mom this morning, she texted me. I know she'll just love me mentioning this, but she texted me a sample label from a product. And she's like, look, this looks like a good product. And I read it and I said, Mom, I'm going to throw this ball back over the fence to you. I said, look, there are 3 sources of sugar in this product. And, I'm laughing with her because she's the one that taught me how to read labels when I was 9. So it's just fun to have that conversation, right? Just reading our labels, looking for sugar in all of its many forms. So I do think it's important to be aware. Just be aware, but don't be fearful. Be empowered through this information. And then we're going to end very quickly so that we have time for questions with some lifestyle tips, because you might say, hey, Deanna, I'm really not going to do much with my food. I'm already eating pretty healthy. Give me some other ideas. Or maybe you just don't want to make any changes in your food. So let's go through 6 of my favorite anti-inflammatory lifestyle tips. And I do think that how we eat is how we live, and how we live is how we eat. They're almost inseparable. So if you make a change in your lifestyle, ultimately you're going to make a change in how you eat, or at least how you relate to your eating. Number 1, find a tribe that has your vibe. So what do I mean by that? I mean, find like-minded people who share your momentum to be healthy, to be happy. Stay around inspiration, stay around support. One of the things, and the reason why I mention this is number 1, is because in the clinic, when I would work one-on-one with somebody and we'd get so excited and they'd feel so inspired, and then they would go home and then they realized that they couldn't actually put everything into motion because they didn't have the support of their family, right? And so I do think that even if we don't have support within our family, maybe the spouse or partner or children aren't on board, we need to find a group. And that's why I set up the Nourish Your Whole Self community on Facebook, which is just a free group. Maggie, Barbie, number of you on this call are actually a part of that group, because I wanted us to stick together in terms of supporting each other on our journey to health and healing. So maybe it's a local group, maybe it's an online group. I really do think it's important to be around people, at least peripherally, if not directly, to support your anti-inflammatory lifestyle. Be in touch with your emotions. Emotions are huge drivers. They're drivers of our eating behavior. They determine how we are, how we live. And I do think that tracking our emotions to our foods is really important. And I have an emotion log in the whole detox book because I want people to track their emotions. Because what I have tended to see is that when people feel a little bit depressed and down, there's a spike in brown, yellow, and white foods. So the color of our foods oftentimes correlates to the color of our moods, and the color of our moods often correlates to the color of our foods. So getting in touch with your emotions, which you can do by connecting, working with them, expressing them. I like art. Some people like music. Other people like to be in nature. You know, really see your emotions as energy that needs to be expressed. And there's intelligence there with what your body is bubbling on up, right? And so we don't want to stuff it down with food. Number 3, as much as you can and as much as you're able, replacing negative thoughts with a more uplifting perspective. So I'm going to tell you what really drove this one home for me. I was reading a study some time ago talking about how being pessimistic or negative had actually led to shrinkage of the brain matter in certain parts, like the big control centers of the brain that do a lot of our signaling of our endocrine system and such, that we can actually change the brain matter through overly pessimistic thinking. There was another study that showed that inflammation was connected to reactivity, right? And so kind of like moving quickly and not really being contemplative. And, you know, this doesn't mean that I'm always thinking positive thoughts by any means. Like sometimes, like even now, there's something this week that happened to me and I was like, I had to kind of reflect on it. And there's a way to do this in such a way where you kind of zoom out. Like if you can almost zoom out of your experience and look at, okay, what am I learning here? What is this person bringing to me? What did this event just show me? How can I think about it in such a way to grow from it? Because of course, not everything is going to be positive. There's a lot of pain and suffering all around us, right? So as much as we can, and if we can't find our place in somewhere that's more positive, I would say go neutral, just in this place. And this is what meditation and other practices really do cultivate, going neutral, right? Just staying not attached to anything. So even if you can release the attachment to something negative and just stay in that neutral zone, that might be more helpful. Move your body and sweat for sure. When you move, my dad has this phrase, I don't know where he got it from. I think he got it from a movie. He said, when you stop moving, you start dying. You know, you got to keep moving, whether it's in mind, in spirit, in body. It's so helpful to move that through. And don't forget the hydration aspect as it relates to inflammation, right? It's important for emotions as well. Number 5, do less of what drains you and more of what inspires you. Maggie and I were having a little conversation on the Nourish Your Whole Self community page about creativity. And she was talking about, you know, how sometimes we may not always feel so creatively inspired. And I feel like sometimes we need to go through those periods in order to kind of come into a burst of creative inspiration, right? So we may not always be on the pulse of what inspires us. So I would say just little by little to bring more of that in as much as we can. Replenish and rest. And I think that we can do that through sleep. We can do it through stillness, through silence. You know, if I think about it, we are so prone to being over technologically inclined, right? So like we go on webinars, we are watching television, we are listening to podcasts. You know, there's an element of quietude that can be very cooling, very anti-inflammatory. It's so beautiful sometimes just to sit in silence. And sometimes you can get that from being within a forest, just taking a walk in nature, not having any kind of headphones in, but really just listening to the sounds, just being one with your surroundings can. And in fact, there's some really beautiful data on forest bathing. They call it forest bathing in the literature, shirin yoku, which is more or less a cultivated Japanese practice of walking through a forest and how anti-inflammatory that is. It calms the sympathetic nervous system. It calms the heart. It reduces a lot of the overreactive signals. And we all know this intuitively. It's like we don't need a lot of science, but it's nice to see that there are actual metrics to that. So there you go. So even if you don't like all of the food things and you feel like I'm already there with food, but what is something else I might be able to do? This would be my short list of different tips. And I'm sure that you have a lot as well to offer in terms of what has helped you. So I definitely want to hear from you and your questions. So I'm going to pause here, and Elizabeth can help to navigate any kind of questions, comments that people have. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Deanna. Fabulous presentation.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
So we had a few questions here. Can you please name again the test that was $54 for tracking your nutrients?
Yes, I can. How about I write it in the chat? It's called Omega Quant. Omega Quant, and you can get that online. And again, I believe it's still in that neighborhood of $54.
Fabulous. Thank you.
You bet.
And oh, fabulous. Someone also agreed, eating the rainbow, most definitely. Oh, and then we had several folks asking about if this is going to be available. So for those of you watching here live on Facebook, of course, you can watch it here again live on Facebook, and also on our YouTube channel. So we got, oh, Deanna, what do you think of air fryers? That's a really good question.
Yeah, well, keep in mind it's got the word fry in it, right? And I know that there's no oil involved in the frying. What I would say is anytime there is dry, hot heat applied as part of the cooking process, there tends to be more of those advanced glycation end products being formed. I have not seen a comparison of, let's just say, vegetables that have been air fried versus just regular fried. I haven't actually seen a comparison done, but I would say let color be your guide. If the food is turning dry, brown, it's getting more crispy, that tells you right there that there can be an implication of having more of these advanced glycation end products. So my preferred method of cooking, just to tell everybody, I didn't mention this, but I also don't like to cook with fat. And it's not because I think fat is unhealthy, because I do think we do need essential fats, but fat breaks down in heat, light, and oxygen, and it can become inflammatory. So even when I'm cooking, let's just say vegetables or protein like fish, I had fish yesterday. And so what I will do is I'll just use a little bit of water. I don't use oil. I bring oil in at the end to kind of seal the flavor, but I don't like to use oil as part of the cooking process. And I know with an air fryer, you don't have that, but you still have the heat. So again, my preference would be more of those slow cook, low moist. I do think water is actually a great conductor of heat. You can do more with water.
Definitely. Oh, we had Maureen say, I use glycemic load versus index. Interesting.
Yeah, that is a good point. I didn't get into all of the nuance there, but glycemic load takes into account the actual grams or the portion. So, and that is a good point, because something like watermelon would have a high glycemic index, but the actual load may be less because we're not having the exact amount of watermelon that would be implicated. But I would even say we need to eventually go beyond glycemic index and glycemic load. We need to be really looking at insulin. It's just that there isn't a good way, like there's an insulin index to couple to and counterpart the glycemic index. But the takeaway from that is just blood sugar. The more we can keep track of blood sugar, I think it's important for looking at overall inflammatory response. So whenever somebody has high blood sugar and high hemoglobin A1C, that's already seen as an inflammatory type of profile. So what you want to do is work on the blood sugar to bring yourself back into a lesser inflamed state.
Definitely. Thank you. And we have Deborah here, and she asked, multigrain versus sourdough bread. That's a good question.
In terms of inflammation, I'm not sure how they stack up. Multigrain versus sourdough. I guess it depends. I'd be looking at the amount of fiber. I'd be looking at the other ingredients in bread and making sense of that. As far as, and bread has sugar, it has yeast, it has some of the things that people are more reactive to. Sourdough has the added benefit of having the probiotics from the fermentation process. So I think that that's good. And then, of course, what are we eating the bread with, right? Because that meal and the response in the body will be determined by everything in that meal, not just the bread itself. So it's a good question. And, there's a lot about fermented foods that can be helpful for repopulating the gut and helping to offset inflammation.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, and we have someone with a raised hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I see Sharon has had her hand up a long time.
Hi, thank you.
Hi,
I'm
Sharon.
allergic to, hi. I've changed my diet, by the way, by just adding more vegetables and more color has really helped me.
Excellent.
I'm allergic to eggs, so sometimes when I make something, I'll use applesauce or flax seeds because it's gelatinous.
Yes.
And I read you should really crush the flax seeds to get more nutrients out of it. And my mortar and pestle doesn't do it. And is that true? Should you break down seeds to open them up?
I think it depends what you would like as from what do you want from the flax seeds? If you want more of that gelatinous paste, like when you're actually doing the cooking, that's one thing. But yes, you do need to grind the flax seeds in order to access the fats and oils that are in the middle of the seed because they're so small. So what I tend to do, I don't go through all of the trouble to grind them myself. I buy ground flaxseed meal. I just buy it in that form. And then I keep that in the freezer as I'm using it so that it doesn't go bad. Because once the flax seeds are ground up into the meal form, what ends up happening is now you expose the fats. Now it will be more rancid or it'll go rancid faster, right? And that's an issue for inflammation.
Thank you. And how about a good cooking pan?
Oh, that's a very good question. I have a whole blog on cookware. I don't know if there is just one good brand. I haven't found one that I'm completely in love with. I have a variety of different pans that I use. Sometimes stainless steel. I have Le Creuset. I have I have a cast iron pan too that I use sometimes. I don't have an issue with iron. So if you have an issue with iron, you want to be conscious of that. But I think that as you're probably asking the question because you're aware of just the toxic nature of some of the cookware that's out there. What I can do for Elizabeth is give you a blog that outlines a lot of the different things to be looking for, but I like diversity. I like using different pots and pans and preferentially towards glass whenever I can, things that are more inert, right? So like if I'm cooking something in the oven, having an oven-proof glass as an example. I'm really trying to veer away from all things. Of course, no Teflon. Teflon would be very toxic. And I would say for the pans that have a lot of the coatings, you have to be really conscientious about what those coatings are made of. But I do have a nice blog on this that outlines it. So I'd be happy to share that.
Thank you.
So, Deanna, you could say that it's Teflon your health.
Yes, that's a very good way to say it. That's right. Yeah, get rid of Teflon is really probably the most toxic cookware available. The other choices, even moving to stainless steel is better, but you have to be just, and especially because I don't cook with oil, and what I have already done is burn through some of my pan. You have to be aware, like if you're cooking in water, the water will dissipate and disappear, whereas oil does not. So you have to be even more attentive when you're cooking without oil, and that also will play into the kind of cookware you have.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, we have a question from another Sharon. How do you feel about keto and ketotarian modified for women, especially for anti-inflammatory eating?
I think it depends on the person. You know, I see a ketogenic diet as a therapeutic diet, but I don't know if I see that as a lifelong way to eat. Keep in mind that the ketogenic diet came up by way of looking at epilepsy and neurological conditions, and it became more or less a therapeutic regimen, right? But so many people do keto in different ways, and I mean, you're pulling in a lot of fat, and fat, if it's not in balance, again, back to that omega-3, omega-6 balance, if it's not in balance, it can actually be causing inflammation. So I would definitely do a nutrient dense keto if I had to do a keto type program, and also to ensure that my liver was in good health, because the liver gets kind of cranky when there's too much in the way of fats to process. And then you have to ensure you've got enough bile. And I think some people don't do well with a ketogenic approach, because you can actually be causing some issues if it's not done well. So best to consult with a healthcare practitioner to personalize a dietary regimen for your needs, for sure.
Thank you. Oh, Deborah said this is one of the best classes ever.
Aw, thank you.
Shucks. And Ashley said, is baking okay when it comes to high heat? So I'm wondering if she's referring to like baking muffins.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
like baking like a pan of vegetables, which you would think steaming might be best.
well, I would say, you know, chances are we're going to bake things throughout our lives, right? It's just, I mean, I bake things. And so what I would say is, yes, slow, low heat, try not to get things too crisp. And if you have things that are baked or fried or grilled, complement those with things that are more nutrient dense. Let me give you an example. So there was a study from Dr. Dave Heber many years ago in which he had people eat a hamburger, and he looked at inflammation after eating that burger. And, you know, things went up. Lipids went up, inflammatory markers went up. And then he had them eat that same burger again in a different occasion with half of an avocado. And it flatlined the inflammation. It flatlined the effects that we're seeing in the initial round. So what I'm saying there is there's a way to eat smart, right? So it's not to say that we're never going to have grilled veggies during the summer. Even I eat grilled veggies, and it's not that I'm eating on the straight and narrow path all the time, but there's a way to bring in things that are more nutrient dense, whether it's a leafy green of some type, like a spinach salad with something that's baked, or even bringing in things like if I were thinking about that muffin, making sure I had blueberries or something that we know is very anti-inflammatory to complement perhaps that muffin that might be overly browned. So that's kind of how I would think about it. And again, you don't want to stress about being out, and you want to be able to enjoy the food, because otherwise if you're stressed, it's going to change your digestion, it's going to upregulate inflammation in the body. So there's that balance there, right? And sometimes you have to say like, wow, I that as you move down this path of health and healing, you can become very analytical to the point that it kind of paralyzes you. And I never want that to happen for people, because when I grew up with a health conscious mom, I kind of went in the direction of becoming disordered in my eating, because I became so, I I went in a different direction where I was polarized to that information. So I binged, but then I went into this other direction thereafter where I became very analytical and almost perfectionistic. And I know that that's not healthy either. So that's why I mentioned to everybody that there's a physical and a psychological aspect to inflammation, and to keep those in balance, because even though my mom is really into food, my dad isn't. And, you know, he still has kind of like that psychological aspect of enjoying life. And that's all really important as well. That adds to our inflammatory potential, or anti-inflammatory potential, I suppose. I see Maggie has a question here. Maggie, you're saying, I'm not supposed to eat anything raw. Do you think making soups with lots of veggies?
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of using heat in healthy ways, I do think, Maggie, that making soups, broths, stews, things like that can be very mineral rich and can be in such a format to be better absorbed by the body. So I like that idea a lot. And you know what else I like about that is that would be a way that you can use up all of the vegetable, right? You can use the leaves, the stems, sometimes the scraps that I normally wouldn't eat just outright, I can use for soups. You probably do that as well. But I think that that's a really nice way to bring in a more anti-inflammatory type of vehicle, to our meals, is to have those
Beautiful.
soups.
And that does bring up a good point, because it is heating, but all those nutrients are going into the broth and you're consuming it all those good nutrients. Yum. And you're able to get a little bit more warmth in your gut, which is always good.
Yes. People always ask me, they say, Deanna, should I be eating raw foods, steamed foods, cooked at high heat? And of course, the extremes I never think are too good for everybody, right? It's good to have some balance in between. But you get different things when you cook vegetables. Like you get more of the fat soluble nutrients, you get more of the fibers, which start to unlock with the heat. And so I think for that purpose, you might be losing on the vitamin C side, some of the water soluble vitamins, but you will be gaining in terms of the fat soluble and the fiber type of ingredients.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. LJ said this was great.
Aw, thank you, LJ.
And Catherine said, thank you. Elsa said, the question about the air fryer is something to think about. Very cool. Thank you. Useful information. Thank you, Deanna, from Deb. Ronald said, more fiber for our second brain equals gut equals veggies galore. Couldn't agree
I like
more.
that.
That's cute. I love it. Oh,
Really
wow. Elsa has a question. I'm in Mexico. How can I get your books? So I can enter that information in the chat box.
great. Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here on your Saturday.
Yeah, it's so wonderful. We've had many people on Facebook Live chime in and say thank you
Oh,
as
great.
well. And let's see, let me scroll back up. There's a lot of fantastic questions here. Okay. Let's see. More thank yous. What is the maximum heat you think protein should be cooked at? That's a good question.
Gosh, I don't know. I don't know the max. I think every food is a little bit different. I don't really think about the food as protein. I just think about the food and what would be appropriate to cook the food. But I tend to go lower in temperature and a longer duration than going like really high heat and then a shorter duration. So again, let the color be your guide. Check for the browning of the food. keep on the pulse of that. And when you do eat cooked food, again, bringing in things that are more fresh and color rich.
Eat the rainbow. and not Skittles.
No, that's right. That's right. So, yeah.
Diane had a question. What is the best kind of sauna to help with sweating?
You know, there are all kinds of saunas out there, and some people are always wanting to find like, what's the best one that's least toxic? And what about the wood? And what I would say is I'm no expert in that. Like, I just think anything that gets you sweating is a good thing. It could be physical activity. It could be, the sauna I have is not a very expensive sauna. It's a 2-person sauna that I got from Costco many years ago. It's nothing too, yeah, it's nothing too great. I mean, in terms of like being the most, it's just a box to make you sweat. And they have even, different types of configurations, different kind of like warming suits and things. But I would say as much as you can to be physically active outside and sweating in the ways that were designed and available to us. And if it's cold outside, yes, it's nice to have a sauna. And if you don't have a sauna, a hot bath or wearing additional clothing, I find myself just layers and layers of clothing, even when it's kind of warm, so that I'm sweating more. Sweating is just such a great way to help to eliminate a lot of these heavy metals that build up in our bodies over time. There have been studies on that by Dr. Stephen Jennis. He's in Canada, did some really great research on the topic of sweat and heavy metal excretion. The only thing you have to note is that minerals, you also lose minerals when you sweat. So you want to be repleting your minerals. You want to be repleting the water and the hydration. And water is, it's very important to stay hydrated when you're inflamed. Look for the signs of dehydration, right? Looking at lips, looking at skin. How often are you urinating? I mean, just using the water element to put out the fire within, and making sure that you get your checkups. Treat yourself to good self-care practices. Every year at my birthday, I go, and that whole month, I'm just getting all of my labs, getting my hormones done. I'm getting my vitamins tested. I'm going the extra mile as kind of like this benchmark of self-care, right? Because that's how you stay on the pulse of inflammation. You watch and track your markers, who you are year to year. And if you have some symptoms coming up, definitely go in and get your labs done again. Be looking at things like high sensitivity C-reactive protein, looking at things like homocysteine, looking at fasting blood sugar. A lot of the lipids, whether LDL cholesterol, VLDL, like the whole standard panel that you can get from your doc, should be able to cue you in as to whether or not there could be inflammation. Even elevated cholesterol may be signaling that there's inflammation. It may not be cholesterol itself, but that cholesterol is responding to perhaps something that's underlying in the body. And then what happens to that cholesterol? It could become oxidized. So lots of different tests that we could be getting from our doctors to understand what's going on in our bodies earlier, rather than waiting for the symptoms to come out.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And if it's okay, I'm seeing Diana's asking, can you mention some good labs for a more typical healthcare provider? I just mentioned some of those, Diane, and I'll write them here as well. So HSCRP, sed rate, homocysteine. You can ask for your omega-3s, omega-3 fatty acids. I mean, that's a more standard panel these days. Looking at vitamin D will tell you something about your inflammation immune status. Looking at a comprehensive lipid panel, that's oftentimes done. And any vitamins you can ask for. So typically you can get zinc, you can get iron. Let's see, you can also, I think zinc, iron, vitamin D, these are some of the main ones that just come to mind, but these are pretty standard labs. Asking about B12 can be helpful. Also asking about folate. I'm writing these in the chat just in case people want to make note of them. if you go to a functional medicine doctor, and you can find a functional medicine doc, I'm going to put the website here, functionalmedicine.org. If you go to that site and you put in your zip code, you can find a provider in your area. And I would say somebody trained in functional medicine thinks in terms of root causes. Like, why do you have something? Looking at the lifestyle, looking at all of the body systems, looking at genetics, looking at your timeline of when things started to happen. So a functional medicine provider might be able to help navigate your health and where you're at, because it's kind of like you have to become a detective. You know, when you start getting symptoms, it's like, okay, let's think about this, let's think about that, you know, all the different variables in your life, and you know those best. You know, I have found that working with a team of people is really important, whether it's an acupuncturist, a massage therapist, a primary care practitioner, somebody to coach you through, right? You know, we are in the age of teens, and teams can be really helpful for seeing into a very complex situation within our bodies. Elizabeth, thank you so much. You've been so great at getting all of this organized. And, you know, you do these webinars quite often, right? So you have a couple every month?
Yes, we have them on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and some Saturdays. And we have a few more for the rest of the month. And the February ones are going to be posted here shortly.
Excellent.
Yay.
Excellent. So everybody can keep on learning. It doesn't matter where you live in the world. Definitely. You know, I like to support Marlene's Market in Delhi. They are local for me. I shop at Marlene's. I'll probably head up there today. But what I love about Marlene's is that they offer free education for people. So definitely continue to tap into what they offer and what Elizabeth does. You know, and the upcoming webinars I've seen posted on your Facebook page, they're also on the website.
Yes, yes, they are. And you can access the registration links either way.
Excellent. All right.
Well, thank you everyone so much. This has been a wonderful presentation, wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Deanna.
Oh, thank you all. I love seeing some of you here. This is so great. What a treat for me to see faces. And thank you, Sharon, for your questions. Thanks for verbalizing those. Oh, and Cordula and Patrick, I'm just seeing you now. Oh my goodness, all the way from Germany. My word, we have an international audience. Fantastic.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Thanks so much for being here.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.